We have Professor Nabar's two daughters and family as well as friends here. So I would now like to request upon Professor Vrinda Nabar, Professor Nabar's youngest daughter, who is an author, critic, and a former head of Department of English at the Mumbai University, requesting her to talk about her memories of her father.
Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, Professor Vice Chancellor Pandit, the UDCT Alumni Association, and all you beautiful people gathered here today. At the outset, many thanks to Mr. Mariwala, who unfortunately is absent, and the UDCT Alumni Association for instituting these events, and to Doctors Mehendre and Devarajan for reaching out to my siblings, Vikram and Veena, and requesting me to say a few words about someone who was truly a man for all seasons. For the three of us, coming back to the UDCT is always emotional, for it witnessed our formative years. Our memories extend beyond mere nostalgia, because my father opened up new horizons, offering us access to many great minds, H.W. Florey and Niels Bohr, to name just two. Against today's global backdrop, I sadly recall how eminent scientists from the erstwhile USSR had boisterously danced the Kasachok at one of the many evenings my parents hosted for faculty and visitors. When Pandit Nehru inaugurated the UDCT's Silver Jubilee celebrations, we were repeatedly told by my father how he had nurtured indigenous talent to create a country self-reliant in science and technology. As the director of this remarkable institute for over 10 years, Professor Nabar helmed it through a period of critical growth, mapping the many splendor trajectory which made the UDCT globally recognized as a center of excellence as far back as the 1960s. The video has given you enough information about some of the things that he did, but I just want to add that several of his initiatives, in particular the Center of Advanced Studies in Textiles, Fibers, and Dyes, later known as the Center of Advanced Studies in Applied Chemistry, made the UDCT a fertile ground for international scientific exchanges. But it's Professor Nabar's personal narrative I want to focus on, and it should give every Indian hope. For it was not one of public schools and elite colleges, but of a boy who studied in a small Konkan village, graduated from Wilson College, and went to UMIST in 1932 for a second master's and a PhD in textile chemistry. That village boy won the R.R. Desai Gold Medal at the MSc Bombay, the Patak Prize for the best MSc thesis at Manchester, and a gold medal from the Society of Dyers and Colorists in England for his research publication based on his thesis, and all this was in colonial times. Despite these achievements, my father, who was universally known as Anna, remained a village boy at heart, amalgamating the best of East and West with dignity, self-respect, and no social pretension. He gave up a promising career in industry for an academic profession at less than half the salary and never regretted it. He trained and motivated an entire generation of textile chemists and technologists who manned the country's thriving textiles industry, thriving in those days. He was quiet, reserved, and gentle to a fault. But he had a side very few saw, mischievous, emotional, with flashes of flamboyance and an amazing gift of mimicry. He could smile with a sudden flash of dimples. He had the most amazing dimples, weep when moved, and even dance the flamenco with a surprising lack of inhibition. I don't think any of his colleagues knew that. A true feminist, he did not differentiate between daughters and son. And my parents had an unusual relationship of equality and a marriage of intense passion, love, friendship, deep attachment, and respect for their individual professions. I.e., my mother was a practicing doctor. And together they taught us the dignity of labor and the importance of shared domestic responsibilities. As an academic myself, Anna's liberal, eclectic, and holistic mind inspired me to try to break free from the barriers of my discipline, which is literature, and explore the worlds of science, music, the arts, and political theory. He taught me that it was right to underplay my scholarship and reputation and to promote not myself, but my students and faculty. Mentorship is a buzzword today. We all know it and we all hear it. It's used ad nauseum. But it wasn't when Anna recognized its importance as far back as the 1940s. Perhaps more than in other disciplines, scientific and technical education call for mentorship of the highest order. Anna mentored his research students and faculty, particularly the younger faculty, motivating them to think outside the box and discover innovative uses for what they learned. Mentorship and celebrity culture are by their nature mutually exclusive. Anna valued the first, but shunned the second. On a high as regards research, Professor Nabar's years as director unfortunately impacted his own productivity. If he sometimes regretted this, his regret had more to do with his love for his subject and for the ways in which his research had once motivated others to consolidate the textile industry in India, for my father was a true nationalist. Vikram, Veena, and I are therefore thankful to Mr. Mariwala and the UDCT Alumni Association for their efforts in recognizing the contributions of one of UDCT's prime architects and prime visionaries, and for commemorating him in a way he richly deserves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Vrinda, Professor Vrinda, for reliving history from almost 80 years ago. I would now like to invite Professor Aniruddha Pandit, Vice Chancellor of Institute of Chemical Technology, to speak a few words on this occasion and also introduce our guest speaker of the Professor G.M. Nabar Memorial Oration. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nilesh. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, Shri Dr. Sanjay Mehendale, Nilesh Lele, Dr. R.D. Kale, Professor Joshi, Z.F. Lashkari, Dr. Nabar's family, who have come in force, and Professor Vrinda gave a very eloquent introduction and the background which is so apt for this particular lecture. This oration, this is essentially a second in series of a health professional. The previous one was given by Lieutenant General Dr. Madhuri Kanetkar, an alumnus of the same medical college from where today's speaker, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, is from. It is my pleasant duty to introduce Dr. Soumya Swaminathan to the audience, not that the audience doesn't know who she is, but it is appropriate to point out her contribution to this health indicators which are getting recognized world over by efforts of India in terms of pandemic contribution towards the problems of solving pandemic related issues, be it health, be it societal issues, be it cultural issues. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan is an eminent Indian pediatrician and clinical scientist known for her research on tuberculosis and HIV. She served as a chief scientist at the World Health Organization under the leadership of Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus. She was the Deputy Director of Programs DDP at the World Health Organization. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan received her MBBS from the Armed Forces Medical College in Pune. She has an MD in Pediatrics from All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi. She is a diplomat of National Board from National Board of Examination. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan completed her postdoctoral medical fellowship in neonatology and pediatric pulmonology at the Children's Hospital, Los Angeles at Keck School of Medicine, USC. She has urged countries to conduct whole genome sequences of the SARS-CoV-2 virus more frequently to understand the mutations and to upload the sequences to GISAID project. In the preparation of the Global Health Summit hosted by European Commission and the G20 in May 2021, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan was a member of the event's high-level scientific panel. She has been the member of Board of Directors, Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics since 2023. We could not have found a better orator to give today's talk, and as was pointed out by Dr. Sanjay Mehendale, the objective of these named lectures is to make chemical engineers, chemical technologists aware of the opportunities which do exist in the other fields where the chemical engineering principles can be extended. I request Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, for me it's a tongue twister, to give today's oration. Thank you.
Good morning, namaskar to everybody. Professor Pandit, Dr. Mehendale, other dignitaries present, senior faculty, and of course members of the Dr. G.M. Nabar family. It's indeed a great honor and privilege, and I thank the Alumni Association for having given me this honor. Just looking at the luminaries, the names, as you walk in through this building and see the photographs of the people who have worked here and contributed, it really gives you, goosebumps and a feeling of being, in a historic place. And I think I'm the one who's blessed actually to be here and to have the opportunity to learn more about this institute, the work that especially the founding directors and members did. And I think thank you also for the tribute that you paid to your father and many people of his generation who were true nationalists. They made big sacrifices in their personal lives. They gave up many opportunities that they could have had abroad to come back and work for the nation, and especially after independence, with the feeling that we need to make this nation strong, self-reliant, and build scientific institutions. So I think that was the most inspiring part of the early years I think, was the investment in science and technology and building good institutions across the different scientific disciplines that till today, are holding us in good stead. I mean, just thinking about the pandemic, the one thing that strikes you immediately is that were it not for the investments that have been made in science all these years, we would not have had a vaccine developed in 11 months. We would not have had diagnostics. We would not have had surveillance, genomic technologies. We would not have had the rapid tests that we all use. None of these would have been possible if we had had this pandemic, 30 years ago. And we know from the influenza, the last big pandemic of 1918 to 1920, that, there was a huge, we don't know exactly how many people died, but considering the world population at that time, it is estimated that anywhere between 25-50 million people may have died. So that would have, and today's estimates, even taking into account that, not all deaths were reported, is about 18 to 20 million deaths, which is still a very large number. But if you compare it to the previous pandemic, certainly things could have been much worse. So I think for me, that was one of the lessons really, is that it is really important to invest in science and in human capital in particular, because it's ultimately, it's not the buildings. You can have beautiful buildings, but it's the people who work in these buildings. And again, we know from, our leaders of and our forefathers who laid the foundations, that many of the very excellent work and discoveries that were made in India were done at a time when there wasn't high technology, they weren't fancy buildings. It was only their intellect that they used actually to conduct experiments. And we can list, from Sir C.V. Raman onwards, a long list of people who have contributed to global world of science, but working with very, very basic infrastructure. So many times I think young people believe that you can only contribute if you are in a very fancy institution with lots of very high-tech equipments. But actually another lesson from the pandemic to me was, having had a bird's eye view from the WHO, was that some countries with very basic infrastructure, in fact low-income countries, low-middle-income countries like Vietnam, like Thailand, like Rwanda, like Senegal, they actually did a much better job of controlling the outbreaks than the highest income countries. And it was very paradoxical that previous surveys and indices that had been worked, there are some global indices that talk about preparedness, and the US actually ranked number 1 on pandemic preparedness. But if you look at the per capita mortality, the US is actually ranking number 1 or close to number 1 in the number of people who died. Many of those deaths were preventable. So I think we realized that sometimes some of these indicators may not really mean much. And what is more important is an investment in the basic services, primary health care, community health workers, communication strategies, building the trust with community. So maybe I'll take a step back. I had given 3 areas that I would cover in my talk: the lessons for science, the lessons for public health, and perhaps the third one for communication, which I happened to be thrown into a lot, which was not one of the things that was planned out for me. So when I went to the WHO, my role was different. When I went at the end of 2017, I went as the Deputy Director General with the oversight on all our technical programmatic areas. That itself was a very good learning curve for me, because of course the scope of the work at WHO is huge. It covers everything in health, and WHO being a normative agency of the UN and the only global health agency, a lot of countries depend on WHO guidance, WHO recommendations, standards, data, especially those countries who don't have the capacity to do it themselves. So it's a huge responsibility, and the focus of WHO definitely is on the developing world, when we think about making the guideline and recommendations. So from that very broad portfolio, over the next year and a quarter, we went through a process of transformation and emerged with a redesigned structure, because the Director General, Dr. Tedros, as you mentioned, he had taken over in 2017, and he felt that we need to reimagine WHO in the 21st century. It was created, of course, after Second World War, when all the UN agencies were created. In fact, this is the 75th year of WHO today, so 1948. And he felt that we are not fit for purpose. So when we looked at our structure, and there were many suggestions that came from staff and from outside, one of the things that was almost unanimous was that we needed a science division, and a role of a chief scientist was created. And then Dr. Tedros asked me if I would be interested in taking up that, which I was very happy to do, because it very much suited my own interests and my thinking. The role of the chief scientist was new, so we had to imagine, like, what is that role, what does a science division actually do? And I thought of two roles, two aspects of the function. One is inward facing, doing a quality assurance of all WHO's norms and standards. So as you know, every technical department actually produces some guideline, makes a recommendation. We need a uniform quality assurance process. How do you actually make a guideline on a topic? How do you review the literature? How do you synthesize the evidence? What type of external group, expert advisory group is to be set up? How to avoid conflicts of interest? How do you update the guidelines? How do you disseminate them? And finally, how do they get translated into the country level and have an impact? And very often there are gaps in each of these steps. Sometimes guidelines are not updated for many years. Sometimes there are guidelines, but they are not being used in countries for some reason. So all of these aspects were to be reviewed, and then we had to really strengthen. And the vision was that as we're moving into a digital era, then we also move our guidelines into that digital era, where we use things like artificial intelligence to review the literature, to inform when there is a need for an update. And some of these things we were able to test during the pandemic, but these were all plans that were being put in place. And also, how do we provide the guidelines in a very user-friendly format, in a digital format, not as a PDF document, which was the standard at that time, but rather in a more interactive way, where people can today, you want everything on your fingertips. And to assist a health worker in a remote village to make some decisions, how do we actually get that information in her hand through a mobile phone? So that is the direction of travel. It has not completely happened yet, but is definitely one of the changes that's happening on the normative side. The second function of the chief scientist was to be more outward-facing and forward-looking, anticipating actually the changes that might come in science and technology that will impact health. So as we know today, there are very rapid changes. Today, we used to talk about gene editing a few years ago. Now today, with the CRISPR technologies, we know that gene editing can be done probably more safely, more accurately. And there are many trials going on now to cure genetic diseases by using, of course, it is still very expensive technology. It's still not available in very few places. But the potential to cure somebody with a genetic disease due to alteration of one gene is now a possibility with these type of new gene editing. However, it raises not only the scientific questions and technological of how do you do it, how do you bring down the cost, how do you make it available to people, etc., but also a lot of ethical, legal, and other issues, social issues, right? Because there are always very thin lines when you come to new technologies. Any new technology can be used for good. It can also be used for harm, as we've seen in our history, starting with earliest invention of fire and to nuclear technologies. So this is why you need to grapple with the regulations around new technologies. And so about 2 years ago, we just before the pandemic had set up a group at WHO to look at what would be ethical and legal regulatory framework to oversee the use of these the gene editing technology in particular, because it has potential for good, but at the same time it needs to be regulated by countries so that you don't allow the kind of experiments which were done actually by the Chinese scientist when he gene edited the two embryos, where he was tried to manipulate a gene that would make them resistant to HIV infection. But the fact that he did it in an embryo and he did it in a way that became a heritable gene, that means that those two babies would be passing on that mutation to their offspring in the future. So the difference between somatic and germline gene editing, somatic gene editing, it stays with the individual with whom you have made the change, but in a germline gene editing, you're passing on that trait to future generations, and the safety of that is not yet established. So this person did his experiments. Of course, then he was put in jail, etc., by the Chinese government, because there was a huge international outrage how he could have done it to babies who were then born. And there was then a call for a moratorium on this type of experimentation. So I'm giving that as an example of technologies which impact on human health, for which we need to be prepared and anticipate and have the necessary tools and frameworks to use those technologies wisely and ethically and safely. Artificial intelligence is another good example. Everybody now today, I think, must have tried ChatGPT. It is quite incredible what ChatGPT does. But AI itself today is in every field. I'm sure that in your areas also that AI plays a role. And it again has a very positive, it can probably speed up drug discovery, development. It certainly helps a lot in doing routine functions where human beings may take a long time. But if you train an AI algorithm, so there are applications in medicine like reading of chest x-rays or reading of pathology slides, making diagnosis from looking at eye, retina, etc. We don't have the specialists available. This could be a good way of screening populations who may be in remote areas, etc. So it has a lot of very positive applications, but at the same time, obviously we know that AI could also be used for or misused. And so we at the WHO had another group similarly looking at how does one govern the use of AI as applied to health. And there were checklists there for developers. AI, of course, the other thing one always has to be conscious of is that how you develop and train the algorithm, you can introduce biases in that. So this has now been recognized that very often AI algorithms were developed and trained on, let us say, only white males in the US or in a high-income country. But suddenly you found that that does not apply to a woman, an African, or an Asian. So the biases need to be kept in mind, but there were checklists developed for the AI developers, but also for users, for hospitals, and for governments on how to regulate it. And today I think the ICMR also has come out with guidelines for India on regulations around AI use in health. So these are examples of how when we think about advances in medicine, we also have to consider the ethical and social implications. And in fact, many of these topics actually need to be discussed with the public. There needs to be much more civil society debate. Today we talk about data and data protection, but how many of us have really engaged in depth with the data protection rules or law that is being proposed? How much of our data are we willing to share with the government, and for what purpose, right? There are countries in which the citizens are very happy to share their health information with their government because they believe that it will be used only for good outcomes, policy making and making changes in government investments in certain areas, etc. Because it certainly helps the government to have that kind of information from their population. In India today, we do not even have complete birth and death registration. So we do not know what people are actually dying of. Unlike countries which have very good complete death registration systems, they can have on a real-time basis information on the causes of death of people in their own population, and they can look at trends and they can look at the data and they can make decisions. So this is a very essential, what is called as civil registration and vital statistics. Birth and death, unfortunately, has been something that we have not been able to do it well, and because of that, you then have to use modeling to estimate certain things, and modelings always have some errors in it. So there are some very basic and essential requirements. Of course, today with digital technologies, we will be able to overcome some of the barriers perhaps in the past, but still the systems need to be robust and they need to be put in place. With just taking again, maybe going back into the pandemic days, and what for me was one of the very positive experiences that I had, despite all of the, the anxiety and the very stressful events, particularly in the first year of the pandemic when we didn't know much and we had to anticipate and we had to make recommendations with very limited information. And at the same time, what we did do, which was positive, was started engaging globally with scientists. In fact, in February of 2020, we had a big research and innovation forum, a global forum where we actually convened about 400 scientists to really think about how to advance research for COVID-19. At that time, it was not even called COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. It was still called as a novel coronavirus. But in those 3 days that we sat, we developed a roadmap for research, identifying all the gaps in knowledge, what are the research priorities, and the scientists actually self-formed into groups. And it was amazing to see over the next few months how these international groups of scientists came together through, of course, virtually, and worked day and night to advance the knowledge and worked with WHO as a sort of convening body. The work was all being done by people around the world. WHO was convening them, bringing them together, they were sharing information. There was no hesitation in sharing the latest data. Nobody was holding back data because they wanted to publish a paper. It was all being done for the public good. And this also enabled us not only to learn much more about the virus and its clinical features, etc., but also to set the benchmarks and standards for what products we need to be developed. So again, in March or April of 2020, we had developed the target product profiles for what a vaccine should look like, what should be the properties of a vaccine. And we set the benchmark quite, I would say, low at 50% efficacy, because we didn't know at that time whether there would ever be a successful vaccine, and we certainly did not expect such high efficacy from all the vaccines that were developed. So 50% was considered to be a good enough vaccine, and then there were, of course, confidence intervals around that. There were safety parameters also. So the developers knew very clearly what they were aiming for, and I think that is a lesson for us here in India also, that if we are now thinking of some of our big public health problems, diseases that we have not been able to control, infectious diseases that we are still wanting to eliminate, for which we don't have vaccines. TB is a good example, malaria, HIV, dengue, chikungunya, the whole list of emerging or re-emerging or endemic infections for which we don't have all the tools that we need. We don't have rapid diagnostic tests for TB, for example, which like we have for COVID. We don't have a good vaccine. The treatment duration is still quite long and sometimes quite toxic. So there is a need for much more research on TB, and it would be a very good disease, but particularly with the Prime Minister's call to eliminate TB from India ahead of the global targets. We need to accelerate the innovation, the research. And we were talking, few of us earlier before this, that perhaps in India there may be, in many labs around the country, some potential products, some research findings, or something that was developed and just went up to the proof of principle and did not go beyond that. And what if we can do an inventory of all of such promising compounds, and then have a national group or a mission to take those forward, so that we are developing products from our own research, from our own institutions. And I think that again, when we were talking about our great scientists of the past, reminded of what drove them actually, was really to use the research and science done in India to solve our own problems rather than waiting for somebody else to come and solve our problems. So for that you need a mission. For COVID, that's what happened. There was global call, there was a collaboration, solidarity, but there was also a lot of funding put in. Governments are estimated to have spent about $100 billion on COVID vaccines, all put together. And annual expenditure on TB vaccine R&D is estimated to be about $1 billion, and it's never gone. Not just vaccine, I'm sorry, TB R&D as a whole is $1 billion. So vaccines is only about 25% of that. So we know that with that kind of investment that went into COVID, but wasn't just the money, it was, I think, the purpose, and it was having some benchmarks, it was having this collaborative approach of sharing data and information. Each one was building on another one, research, and there was also regulatory harmonization. In the usual way of approving drugs and vaccines is, of course, that you go to every regulator in each country. The company has to go and provide a dossier, and then that's looked at, etc. And it's a country-by-country approval process, which can be very slow and time-consuming, and often takes years before you have access to a new drug or a product. Whereas here, all the major regulators of the world came together, with WHO also in that group, and pre-decided or pre-agreed on the benchmarks, the standards, and also agreed that WHO's emergency use authorization meant that they would all accept that. So the FDA, the EMA, the WHO, they were all aligned. There was never any confusion. As far as vaccines were concerned, in terms of drugs, it was not so well, it didn't work so well, because the FDA was approving based on their own criteria. There was a lot of politics at that time. President Trump was the president, and he was interfering with all scientific decisions being made by the agencies there. So very often we were not in alignment with FDA as far as our, but I must say that we used to have these press conferences, and I remember one press conference when we had findings on a particular drug, which we had to talk about, and I told the Director General that this will be actually not in line with what the FDA has done, and this may become quite controversial, and he said it's not a problem. We need to be very true with whatever our findings are, and if you're confident of your data, you go ahead, and we can always face, and there were a lot of media articles written about the fact that WHO, in fact, we came out in a better light, because it was clear that FDA was under political pressure at that time. So the regulators must never come under political pressure, and it's very important to have a very strong, independent, credible regulator, because it's a question of quality, and it's a question of life and death, and you can't play and take lightly these regulatory decisions. So I think those, once you have the research findings, also you should be able to use them for policy making and for developing the guidelines. And again, there we did very quickly. Every time a new clinical trial was coming out, we were able to update our treatment guidelines for COVID and the vaccine guidelines as well. And then, of course, there has to be continued pharmacovigilance. When you're dealing with new products being introduced very rapidly into the population, you go with limited information. Of course, you have to convince yourself that the benefit outweighs the risks. That's how these vaccines were given emergency use authorization. But you never know that there are very rare side effects which could come once it's rolled out into millions or billions of people. So that pharmacovigilance, the reporting, and the continued awareness and decision making and changes in policy that may be needed are really important. The one thing that also kept worrying us was the issue of access. We knew that in the past we had many examples, HIV, other diseases, where the drugs were not available to people in developing countries for many, many years. And in fact, in HIV, it was people like Dr. Yusuf Hamid who changed the whole global status quo at that time and made possible for people in Africa and Asia and other countries to get the same medicines, but they were high quality but affordable. So Indian generics today, of course, supply a large part of the world's requirement of both drugs and vaccines. So the group that was set up called the ACT Accelerator, of which COVAX was one part, which dealt with vaccines, with which I was associated, was meant to look at end-to-end. How are we going to develop and then procure, distribute, deliver vaccines to the entire world's population? It's a task that had never been done before. And so there were many global organizations that came together and said, let us work together to do this. So we worked with Gavi, with CEPI, which funds R&D. Gavi does procurement and distribution, mainly childhood vaccines, but in this case, they were doing for the COVID vaccines. WHO does all of the normative regulatory policy work. And then UNICEF on the delivery side. These were the four major partners. There was a lot of funding put in there from governments, from philanthropy. But then the problem was really during 21 that all countries that were manufacturing vaccines were using it for their own populations. And so there was a moratorium on exports. And so COVAX did not have the volume of vaccines that were needed for, let us say, the whole of Africa was dependent on imports because they don't have any manufacturing capacity. And there was, of course, a lot of discussion and debate at that time also on intellectual property. Should it be waived? India and South Africa had approached the WTO and asked for a waiver on patents of all COVID-related technologies, but that was never taken forward. And ultimately, after 2.5 years, they came with a very diluted kind of agreement at the WTO, and that didn't help anybody. So for future pandemics, I think the lessons that have been learned are particularly the good, all the good things which happen, but also the not good things. That is the inequities which we saw, where many populations, like even today, it's estimated 70% of the world's population have had at least one dose of the vaccine. So 14 billion doses of vaccine have been administered so far. We have a population of 8 billion globally. And of course, in many countries, children were not given, children under 12. But if you take the lowest income countries, then only 26% of people have had a single dose of the vaccine because of the delays which they faced and the lack of trust and also the lack of capacity in some of those governments to deliver. So to avoid that, of course, the governments today that form the membership of WHO are sitting down together and negotiating a pandemic treaty or a pandemic accord, which will actually have equity as at the heart of things, so that in the next pandemic, you don't have a situation where people are unnecessarily dying in some countries, while in other countries, vaccines are being wasted or were being given to young people, despite the fact that WHO had proposed a way of equitably distributing limited supplies of vaccines in the early days. So one of the lessons we learned was that if you do not have the manufacturing R&D capacity in your own region or country, then you are at mercy of others. And so I and a few others, we set up the mRNA technology transfer program, where we said we will make from scratch using this new technology vaccines. And this would be of interest to you because mRNA technology is purely chemistry. There is no biology in it, and therefore you do not need the kind of infrastructure that you normally need for vaccine development, BSL-3 lab and things like that. You don't need. So it is chemistry, but it's complex, of course, with the lipid nanoparticles, etc., coating the antigen, coating the mRNA. Otherwise, mRNA gets destroyed very rapidly. So there are many Indian scientists also now working on that to not only bring down the cost, but also make it thermostable. As you know, the initial mRNAs which came, the vaccines had to be stored at -70, -20. It was not practical in many countries. So there's a lot of potential to use that, but we felt since the big companies were not sharing the technology, since they were not willing to share know-how, not willing to transfer technology, that we would do it from scratch. And so we put out a call for this type of a technology transfer hub, and South Africa was selected. They had the best application at that time. So they are the hub, and there are 16 other centers, other countries in the world. All are low middle income countries, including India as part of that network today, which will be able to develop this mRNA technology further and develop not COVID vaccines, because now today there's no need for new COVID vaccines, we have enough, but for other diseases which I just mentioned, where there are gaps, where there are needs, but also to develop cancer treatments and things like that, because this, as I said, mRNA is not just for infectious diseases, it is also being used for monoclonal antibody, which you know is used both for cancer, autoimmune diseases, etc. So I think India can be a leader in this if we have the right type of enabling environment. So it just showed that basically you have to break that dependence and have a different paradigm where it's based more on open science, learning, data, open data, where this network today will now share data with each other as they go along. And it's still in infancy, this program, but I'm very proud of this program because it was something that nobody believed actually would work. Without the know-how of the big pharma, they said, how can this be even possible? But the scientists on the ground showed that it was possible. Within about 3 to 4 months, they had constructed the vaccine just from publicly available information and data. The other lessons I would like to mention are the fact that in terms of public health, as I mentioned, some of the countries which are not very rich countries did well because they had invested in public health. One of the best examples I've seen is in Thailand, where the primary health care was a focus for many years of the government. So rather than putting money into big hospitals, they were investing in primary health care. And if you go to the countryside and see how beautifully their primary health care system works, it is really, you feel so happy that a farmer living in a remote village can get peritoneal dialysis in his home, and he's living very comfortably even though he has chronic kidney failure without really having to spend much from his pocket. So primary health care is the way to go for the future, because otherwise it's like a bucket in which you have the tap which is running, the bucket is constantly filling, you're trying to take the water out of that bucket by building hospitals, by treating people with chronic disease. But the tap, if it's open, you're never going to be successful because you will constantly having more and more people falling sick. And no country, today you see even in big countries, high income countries, health systems are all facing huge challenges because their costs are mounting and they're not able to deal with the burden. So we have to really think about the social and economic, environmental determinants of health. What is it that keeps us healthy or makes us sick? And very often it is the air, the water, the sanitation, the food, the diet. These are what are called the determinants of health. And if you, in our country, as in many countries, there are people who cannot afford a healthy, nutritious diet. They cannot get access to clean drinking water. They don't have still good sanitation, even though we have made a lot of improvements. And air pollution is something that is affecting huge numbers of people actually across the world. I think it is said that more than 90% of people globally are living in areas where the air quality standards do not meet the WHO benchmarks. And in India, we have 50 of the 60 top polluted cities of the world are in India. And in most of our cities, the air quality index is way above the WHO cutoff limits. So this is something which is very invisible or visible sometimes, but is a major cause of cardiovascular, respiratory, cancer, neurological, all these diseases we know are impacted by pollution. There's air, there's marine pollution today, which we know even less about, microplastics in our food, etc. So I think if we don't attend to our environment, we are not going to be able to live healthy, and no amount of building of clinics and hospitals or training doctors is going to help us. And So this brings me to the last point, which is around, so one other thing before I go to communication is that the pandemic exacerbated the inequalities. It did not create inequalities, right? What it did was it brought to the fore the inequalities that exist in countries and between countries. So in terms of vaccine access, we saw, yes, Africa was suffering. They did not have access. But if you look within each country, you can easily see the disproportionate impact that the pandemic had on the weaker sections of society, marginalized, more vulnerable, lower socioeconomic group. In high-income countries, they found that racial and ethnic minorities, the black African Americans, they had 2 to 3 times higher death rate than the white Americans. In the UK, they found that people of Asian or African descent, even though doctors and nurses, they had double the risk of dying from COVID. So it's related to a number of other factors, not only genetic or not. It wasn't actually mostly genetic. It was mostly the socioeconomic condition, access to treatment, the family size, the lack of underlying morbidities like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and so on. And then we saw also the impact on education, the impact on livelihoods, the economic impact. All of those were felt much more by poorer countries and by poorer people living in different countries. And so world is unequal, and of course now we have conflict. We have the war in Ukraine, but we also have many other areas of conflict. We have climate change as another crisis, and we have the post-COVID impact. Long COVID I have not talked much about, but there is clearly evidence that COVID is not an acute infection, that it causes long-lasting damage in some people. Maybe 10 to 15% of people who suffer from COVID, they do have a prolonged period of recovery, and there could be longer changes which we are still not fully appreciating, but there are some studies going on which show it affects the brain, it affects cardiovascular system, etc. It raises the risk of diabetes. So the virus is actually not just a respiratory virus. It does impact many organ systems through the blood circulation and the coagulation pathways. So the best, what it showed is an infectious disease, a virus, actually impacted those who had non-communicable diseases much more. So if you already had diabetes, already had an underlying cardiovascular disease, then of course your risk was much higher. So attention again to those risk factors and to good public health measures is going to be important for us as we plan for the future, and a One Health kind of approach where we think about the environment, how are the animals, wild as well as domestic animals, veterinary sector, agriculture, fisheries, and human health as one interconnected whole. It makes up a whole. As far as health literacy and science literacy is concerned, I think that we have a long way to go. We saw during the pandemic that even before a vaccine was developed, we had anti-vaccine groups putting out lots of false information. This will happen, that will happen. They are trying to kill you. Bill Gates is putting a chip so that he can control the world. There were all kinds of conspiracy theories that were being promoted. And this actually had a real impact. It had an impact on people. It made them unsure. It raised unnecessary questions. Questioning is good. It's not that nobody should ever question anything. I think questioning is very good. And governments should be able to answer those questions which people are asking, or a person who develops a product should be able to answer genuine questions. But this type of conspiracy theories, actually what it did is that it led to a lot of vaccine hesitancy. And it's estimated that in the US, for example, at least 100,000 people died. They have a death toll of 1.2 million or something. Of that, 100,000 are estimated to have died only because of vaccine hesitancy. They did not take the vaccine because they were influenced by political ideology or something else. And so that is a real impact of this anti-vaccine and anti-science. So it's not something to take lightly, because today we see that there are now pockets of places in the world where you're having measles outbreak, various cholera outbreaks, other outbreaks, partly because people are not taking their children for vaccination. And I've spoken to people from Africa where they say the mothers are now reluctant to even give childhood vaccination because they believe that they will also be given COVID, and they don't want to take the COVID vaccine. They're very afraid of it. So I think the whole, and it's not only about vaccination. Yesterday I was talking to a few people at TIFR, and they're actually doing a very interesting survey in adolescent school children, asking, trying to find out what they know about vaccines and how's their acceptance, and do they have any hesitancy. Because as you know, India is rolling out now HPV vaccine to prevent against cervical cancer. That will be given to adolescent girls who have never received vaccines before for anything else. So to understand from COVID how they reacted and whether they have any misconceptions. It's not really being taught in their biology textbooks. So I think reviewing our curriculum, but also the TIFR science outreach program, I think is a very nice, good example of scientists trying to reach to the public, children and adults, to discuss topics which are, people should be aware of, and it not only inculcates interest in science in children, but it also helps to address some of these myths as well as misconceptions. So science communication, I think, is something that probably we are never taught in school or college. So one learns it as you go along. Of course, some people are better at it than others, but I think, again, there are some scientists who need to be good communicators in order to talk about the work that goes on in these labs. Most people will not understand what goes on and how is it relevant to them, how is it useful to them. So we have to start from school, and we need to also look at how social and behavioral sciences can be used as part of our public health programming, because behavior change communication is not something very straightforward. Just because you tell me to do something, I'm not going to do it necessarily, right? So if you want to change my behavior, then it requires a different approach, and that is what behavioral science is about. So that's not something, again, that's very widely used or known. So our public health programs actually need to. Tobacco control is a good example of where there have been both legal and policy regulations brought in, but also behavior change communication has played a big role actually in reducing the use of tobacco. Similarly, I think we need to do it for alcohol and for many other things which are problematic today. So there are many challenges ahead for public health, but I think what we need is more awareness, more commitment, a better way of working together, perhaps identifying the key priority areas, a mission mode, setting targets and goals as has been done for tuberculosis. But infectious diseases is one thing, but the non-communicable diseases, the chronic, those are much more complex. They are much more multifactorial. There is no vaccine for them. And therefore, they need interventions which also include the private sector, the commercial, what we call as a commercial determinants of health today, which can impact health either positively or negatively. So what companies do, what industries do, can impact, of course, environment, and we all now talk about green technology, etc., but it can also impact people's health. And so I think we have not paid enough attention to the commercial determinants, and probably going forward, we'll have to do that. So with that, I think I'll stop. I just shared some of the reflections and experiences that I had, which I think are relevant, and I hope that you found it interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. It was a captivating speech. Ma'am, with your permission, can we take one or two questions? So, any questions from the audience? Yeah. Yeah, Ravi sir.
Fascinating talk, and I think everybody in the audience probably agrees with such that mean, many of us have seen you on television answering press conferences, and I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that we're very proud that an Indian was out there trying to steer the agenda. My question is, I mean, there's now a lot of talk about COVID back here. There is also the virus mutating. I mean, do you think realistically there is a chance that we could go back to 2 years ago and have that kind of severity back as a large threat to the populations here? And part two is, you haven't touched upon the economic impacts that COVID did. Could you, I mean, would be, if you had to rethink that, was the lockdown the best way to do this? Would we ever go back to something like that again?
Thank you. Yeah, those are really very good good questions. So maybe to take the first one, I don't think we'll go back to what happened in 2020 and 21 because we have a very high vaccination coverage in our country and in many countries. And of course, as the virus mutates, what it does is it tries to always overcome the immunity that exists in human beings. So that is their survival mechanism. And so that's why today you see this new variant in India, which is able to evade immunity. So even if you've been vaccinated, it's not going to protect you from getting the infection. But hopefully the vaccination still protects you from getting severe disease. Now, just yesterday I saw that the WHO SAGE, which is the policy committee for immunization, has said that a repeat booster is going to be very important, especially if more than 6 months have passed since the last vaccine. And in India, the booster coverage is extremely low. I think it's something like less than 20%. So particularly for older people, for people who do have risk factors, it's a good idea to have that third dose if not had previously. Of course, we also know now the other tools like masking, etc. So many state governments are now bringing in, so we are able to act. And I don't think we will never go back into a lockdown for sure. On the economic side, I didn't go into the details, but there are many IMF and we have, I think, an expert from the IMF here, the World Bank, etc., who made a lot of projections on huge, I mean, it's in trillions of dollars, the world's economic, the impact that it had on the world, but also the recovery is faster in some countries and much slower, particularly in those poor countries who have gone further and further into debt. The debt reservicing itself today is more than, almost the entire GDP of the country. So this is something the global financial institutions, I think, are discussing and grappling with. How do you make those countries actually recover if they are facing such a high debt? But I think even more serious than that is the impact that the closure of schools had on children. And what happened actually is that I was in Switzerland at that time. The schools there closed for 3 weeks in March of 2020, when the lockdowns and shutdowns were happening. They opened by mid-April because by the time they figured out that children were not being impacted to that extent. There was enough data from China and so on, even from Italy by then, to show that it was the elderly that was being impacted. And so if you could protect them, then children should be in school. And they took all the precautions, etc. Whereas in developing countries, we had for some reason, schools were kept closed, for 18 to 24 months. And it's estimated that the impact on the school-going children would have a future loss of their lifetime earnings of something like, $17 trillion or something has been estimated. Because I've also seen the impact on the children, particularly from lower socioeconomic group who could not have access to online education. They've really had a setback, which they're finding it very difficult to come back from. And the third area is food insecurity. There was a loss of livelihoods. So the numbers of people who go to bed hungry has increased for the first time in many decades. And also the number of undernourished have increased. It's also being, of course, exacerbated by the war in Ukraine and the food supplies, the wheat supplies, and also climate change, which is now making many people migrate and leave If you look at the Sahel and if you look at what is happening in the Horn of Africa, again those mass starvations and things are becoming, too close to reality. So it's the intersection of many crises, but certainly the post-COVID economic impact will be felt, for a long time. I don't know if I
Thank you.
left out
Yeah, Dr. Kundikar.
Hello, it was nice talk. Do you believe in immunity enhancement? Is it possible? Immunity enhancement. It is a preventive aspect, we can say.
Yes.
You mean through dietary supplement?
Maybe through Ayurveda or naturopathy. Various aspects of those.
So immunity is a very complex thing because it's not one thing that constitutes our immune response. It's a whole lot of different cellular functions that constitute our whole immune response. So for example, you have something called innate immunity. And innate immunity is what actually is the first response that the body has to any external agent. And that is non-specific. It could be a virus or a bacteria, or it could be a physical threat. That innate immune response is the first to thing. But in some cases it may be successful. And in fact, there were many people who were trying to boost up that innate immunity through giving things like interferon alpha, through nasal sprays. But also BCG is a vaccine that is known to stimulate a non-specific immune response. So if you take BCG, then it just generally boosts your immunity, even though it doesn't have any specific action against bacteria or even against TB itself. So when we talk about having a good immune system or boosting immunity, I think it depends on nutrition, it depends on many other things, and I think that is where Ayurveda plays a role, because it tries to balance out all of those things and give you the most healthy. So in terms of well-being and wellness, I think Ayurveda and other traditional practices, yoga, etc., basically they do help. But what we cannot say that they will do is protect specifically against COVID or specifically against influenza. For that you need specific antibodies in your blood, which you can only get through either vaccination or through natural infection. So there is no way to enhance your immunity to the point where you will become immune to different infectious diseases. But yes, you could have a much stronger immune response, so that if you get infected with COVID, perhaps and this is what we saw, many people got COVID and they had very mild disease, and many people got very, very sick. And we still don't understand fully why, a lot of studies have been done on genetics, but also on risk factors, etc. But it's a very fascinating area actually to study. What we need in India, I think, are more good, well-conducted studies and trials of Ayurvedic or natural herbal products where we think that they have some role, could have a role, but we need to prove it. We need to do the studies. And unfortunately, that was not done. And many, many products were being promoted for COVID without much of evidence base. So that actually has a negative impact, because then it reduces the credibility of a field of medicine which could actually have a lot to offer. So I think that's where we still need to come together, where Ayurvedic, when I was in ICMR, we had tried actually, Dr. Nilima, you will remember, we worked with Ayush to see if some of their products could be taken into clinical trials, for dengue and for diseases like that, especially where allopathy has no cure.
Yeah. I believe in food is your medicine. That's what I am practicing for last 50 years.
Right.
And I have no problem so far. on
You're
health.
very right. Food has a huge impact on our health.
Thank you. Ma'am, how many more questions we can take? I know you have a
Nilesh.
flight to catch.
Maybe one or two more.
One or two more? Okay.
If I
Please.
may.
Yes, yes, please.
Fascinating talk, ma'am. Your views on the WHO's attempt to trace the origin. There are a lot of stories, wrong or right, spread about it in terms of. So, was there really a political problem or in
No,
terms
the
of...
problem is very simple. It's a lack of transparency from the Chinese authorities. They are not allowing access to all the data. So WHO has been trying from day one. And in fact, the DG in the beginning, everybody said, why is he so pro-China? He was actually trying to build a good relationship so that they will cooperate with the investigations. And there have been many teams that have gone there, but without sharing of the data, it's very difficult to come to any conclusion. So I think we still don't know. We believe, most people think it's an animal origin which came out of that food market, because there's so many different animals mixed up there, all live animals. So it's very easy for viruses to jump from one animal to another or from animal to human. That's probably the strongest possibility, but there's also the other hypotheses, like it escaped from a lab, it was a accidental lab thing and all that. It's on the table actually, nothing has been ruled out.
Yeah. Dr. Habu?
Ma'am, one of the learnings could have been that, not just India, but the world over, there was data deficit, in logging in, legacy data of deaths and births and everything. So is that a learning particularly in need in India? I mean, forget the political part of it, but are steps being taken to improve that part of it in case future, otherwise it will always get overcast by political, the considerations.
Absolutely.
And the other question is about Pfizer. All the talk about it, leaving aside the political arguments, the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine. Thank you.
So on the first question, I did mention about births and deaths and how important it is, and India needs to do a lot more actually to improve the data that we collect from the ground. I hope it's a priority. I'm not sure. Pfizer, I think in terms of the whatever data there is on the vaccine, it's a highly efficacious and safe vaccine. So I don't have any doubts about that. Everything else is yes, their behavior you can criticize, and the way they made profits rather, than prioritize public health, all that I agree with. But in terms of the actual science behind the vaccine, excellent.
Okay.
Fascinating talk, ma'am. One specific question, and that is, the delay between announcing it to be airborne, and that was quite a substantial delay. You think it was basically because of lack of knowledge, physics coupled with what is defined as a micron and all that mode of transmission, or it was more to do with bureaucracy of a large, United Nations organization?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I was describing how these guidelines are changing and things like that. So actually a lot of the work on the transmission was done by aerosol engineers, by physicists, not by medical people who sit in WHO committees. So these people from different disciplines had come together and they had done some very good research. And then later on they were brought, into the committees. But initially I think the committees that were looking at, and all WHO guidelines are made by external committees, not by WHO staff. So the existing committee on infection prevention and control had taken a very conservative approach and were not, I think, very open to taking this new data on board quickly enough. But from WHO's side, our communication had shifted, even though we may not have said aerosol transmission, etc., but we were already talking about the different ways in which it spreads, why ventilation is important, why being outdoor is important, and that being in the same room, even if you are at a distance, you are still at risk. So I think in terms of the mitigation measures, they were actually talked about without very elaborately describing what aerosol transmission is. So later on, of course, we tried to correct that, but sometimes you do get stuck in these large organizations with different groups which are refusing to actually align, and one of the problems was the existing definition of airborne transmission, and WHO itself was outdated, that needed to be updated. So it was things like that.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am, for a wonderful talk. I have a question, two questions. One is related to your touch upon mRNA technology to public health. And as the new center in South Africa has now started functioning, and I'm just taking question from Dr. Habbus. Compare it to technologies of mRNA, whole virus, which is Covaxin, viral particles, Covishield, or protein vaccines. So though the question is that efficacy-wise, as you have rightly said, the science is pretty good, but do we have any statistics or a pharmacovigilance data? Because if we see number of repeat infections which have happened or may be reported in the developed world much more than the population which is being injected by a whole virus or VLP kind of a vaccine. That's question number one. Question number two is the idea of international harmonization of regulators. So each regulator, you know very well, have worked independently. So is WHO trying to harmonize? We have ICH, we have OECD, but somehow all regulator works very independently. So is there any outlook from WHO side that in such a situation whether some harmonization body can be created? Thank you.
Yeah, so good questions. I think on the regulatory side, I mentioned that, there's the International Committee of Medical Regulatory Agencies, ICMRA, which has been working and which worked very intensively during the pandemic. WHO is a non-voting member of that group, and that's how they were able to actually move ahead quickly by harmonizing. And India's DCGI is also part of that group. I think for the future, perhaps we need to think also about regional regulatory networks. There was a Southeast Asia regulatory network that was created a few years ago. I think it's not active at all. So it would be good to activate that and at least have a regional network. Africa has now set up the Africa Medicines Agency, which they are planning it to be something like the European Medicines Agency. So I think regions are moving in that direction, and it will be very useful. Ultimately, it will help accelerate access to medicines and health products. On your first question of the different vaccines, and it's a good question. There was no study done to compare them all. Ideally, there would have been one clinical trial with the same endpoints, the same methods, and you could have put each of those vaccines in. That would be ideal methodology where you can actually say, okay, this one has so much efficacy, but it has some other downside or a side effect. That was not done. So each trial was done by the company separately. The definitions used were different, the endpoints were different, the follow-up was different, the sample size was different. So there is no way today in which we can compare. And so we can only say, yes, this vaccine has this much of efficacy, and over a period of time, of course, all of them wane, they all go down. And particularly with Omicron, you found a dramatic reduction in the efficacy against infection, not against severe disease. But the other problem that you alluded to was side effects are being reported from high-income countries and we haven't. I think that is more a problem of our system of pharmacovigilance. So if Africa is not reporting any side effects, doesn't mean they're not having side effects. They didn't report any deaths also. That doesn't mean that people didn't die. But if you don't have a system to capture it, then how will you report it? So sometimes people think, because the mRNA vaccines were basically rolled out in high-income countries, there's so much data now available. And so that's why we know the rare side effects of myocarditis, etc. For AstraZeneca, the Covishield, we know the rare side effects of clots, emboli, etc. But unless those data are collected firstly, analyzed properly, and then transparently reported, you'll never know with other vaccines. So this is again an area where we need to strengthen. Probably like we did for drugs, we had a platform trial, the Solidarity trial, where many drugs, repurposed drugs, were being tested. For vaccines also, it would have been very nice to do that, but the companies were really not willing, and also they wanted to move very fast. So that is why we don't have comparative data.
Thank you. Thank you, madam, and great questions from our audience. As a sign of our love, we would like to felicitate you, ma'am, and give you a token of appreciation. For that, I invite our UDCT Alumni Association President, Dr. Sanjay Mehendale, and our ICT Vice Chancellor, Professor Pandit. Yeah, maybe we can come in the front.
Just before we do that, I think just to sum up, based on whatever Dr. Soumya talked about and whatever questions are put by the audience, this is a golden opportunity for the whole world to recalibrate itself in terms of whatever currently we are and what is our path in terms of progress. If we draw this conclusion and everybody to the best of their own ability start working towards it, be it environment, be it health, be it communication, be it openness, this is a golden opportunity for us to recalibrate our priorities and work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mendale and Professor Pandit. We have now reached to the end of today's program, and it's a custom that current departmental head proposes a vote of thanks. Since Professor G.M. Nabar was from Textiles Department, I would now like to invite Professor Ravindra Kale, Head of Departments of Fibers and Textile Processing Technology at ICT, to propose a vote of thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Nilesh. Good morning and warm welcome to all the dignitaries and audiences. I would like to officially thank today's speaker, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, former Chief Scientist WHO, for taking time out of her busy schedule and delivering the UAA Professor G.M. Nabar Memorial Oration. We couldn't have a better speaker than her given the current situation where the COVID cases are continuously on rise. She dwelled elaborately about the preparedness of the WHO in managing different health issues including pandemic. Also the use of technology tools like artificial intelligence in improving the healthcare and medicine facilities for the people. Also the importance of having a capable R&D facilities in order to meet any emergency medical situations. As every one of us have come across different WhatsApp messages or videos doing the rounds during the corona pandemic, spreading misinformation rather than right information. So madam, once again, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I would also like to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor A.B. Pandit, for his support and presence at this event. A special thanks to Mr. Kishore Mariwala for initiating this series of lectures in the honor of former directors and luminaries of UDCT ICT. Once again, I would like to thank Mr. Vikram Nabar, Ms. Vrunda Nabar and Nabar family for sharing the fond memories of Professor G.M. Nabar. In fact, many of us are not much aware of his contributions. So through this video and my interaction with the Nabar family, I came to know many aspects of the Professor G.M. Nabar. A special thanks to Professor J.B. Joshi, Padma Bhushan, and all the other ICT faculty members, advisory board members, UDCT Alumni Association, especially Dr. Mehendale and Nilesh Lele for their untiring efforts in organizing today's event. BOG members, students, everybody who attended today's oration to make this event successful. With this, I officially announce the closure of today's program and request everyone to stand up for the national anthem. Thank you.
Punjab, Sindh, Gujarat.